to even get a modest room full of people when there's the Cowboys game still going on is a testament that there are other things in Dallas than football. I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm going to have the pleasure of doing a little tiny slideshow before the two of us have a chat about Philip Johnson's sacred architecture, from the beginning of his career to what will be the culminant building of this part of his career. And since we all know that he keeps living forever, there'll, I'm sure, be another great religious building which is consecrated in 2005, someplace or another. The sacred spaces of Philip Johnson's, I've visited all but one, and it's the newest one, and it's the closest to here, actually. It's in Houston. And it's the building that I'm going to end my little talk with, but I thought it'd be good for all of us to look at a few slides. I begin with his first building, which is not a sacred space at all, but his house in Cambridge, when he was going to graduate school in architecture at Harvard. I went to Yale, and it's sort of hard for me to even admit that he went to Harvard, but he at least now teaches at Yale, and so it's okay. But what it does is it shows all of us who are accustomed to looking at architecture that for Philip Johnson, even living is a ceremonial and sacred act. And this dining room, with its 2 candelabras, its 2 mise chairs, its perfect table, its painting by Mata on the end wall, has all of the ceremonial rigor of an altar for a communion, and the sense of order, and that a good deal of the most valid architectural experience comes from the sacred, and that the sacred inhabits all of our lives, is a really important part of Philip Johnson's architecture. One sees it in his own house, which he built for himself in the early 1950s, and in which he lives today in New Canaan, Connecticut, which creates a sort of tapestry of the world around it, and which every chair and every table, every picture and every sculpture is placed with a kind of rigor that creates for living an act of ritual. Or entering an office building. This is an office building in Boston. If you go to work in the morning in downtown Boston, you get off the T and you sort of slog through the streets and you go through a little revolving door, and this is what you see. And this is what you walk through, and these spaces are spaces that reorient you completely, whether you work every day in that office or whether you're visiting someone on a one-time basis. And the sense that the logic of sacred architecture inhabits all of Philip Johnson's architecture is a very important message. Philip Johnson began to design buildings that are sacred buildings for a faith that is not his own. In fact, his first important sacred building is a synagogue in Port Chester, New York, for which he received the commission, and he received it in 1954, and the building was finished in 1956. And it is a stately and noble and simple building, built almost exactly at the same time as Frank Lloyd Wright was doing his synagogue in Elkins Park outside of Philadelphia. And 2 buildings by 2 non-Jewish architects that forever changed the way that Jews thought about sacred space. And that is an achievement. This little cylindrical or sort of oval building to the front of the building that you see as a kind of space definer, as a creator of sacred entrance, so you don't walk immediately into the sacred space. And then when you do, you see a simple, noble room with simple colored glass, its structure very clear, and then the suspended tent, which the rabbi, when it was new, was fond of thinking of as being a memory of the earliest religious spaces of the Jews, which were, after all, tents. And so this building, which makes eternal and lasting a memory of something that was millennially old, is something that within the rubric of modernism in 1954 and 1955, when he was designing this building, he was able to do. I had one of the great adventures last summer when I was driving back from Williamstown, Massachusetts, where we spend the summer sometimes, to Dallas, of driving through a little town called New Harmony, Indiana. And when you go to New Harmony, you go over a wonderful 2-lane toll bridge, which costs 10 cents to go over. And you tool across this bridge and you see an incredibly brilliant building by Richard Meyer that greets you, and then you go down a street of superb early 19th century American buildings, and you run across a long brick wall that stands behind a row of now mature and really noble trees. And you enter that brick wall and you enter the roofless church, that only the altar or sanctuary is lit. And this is one of the most profound sacred spaces I've ever visited. It's a church with no roof. The sky is its roof. Its boundaries are set, and its boundaries are so big that when you get into the inside, you feel that you're in a community of others. And you go to the altar, and the altar, here in a Christian church in a town that was one of the great utopian towns of America. And in this extraordinary sort of baldacchino covered in wood, rising from a brick and stone enclosure, is a sculpture by Lipschitz, who was a Jew. And Lipschitz announces to you on the bronze of the sculpture that he has created a virgin as a practicing Jew, as an example of the life of the Spirit today. And this idea of transcending faiths and communicating beyond is something that Philip Johnson has done in his career as a sacred architect since the very beginning. I include a space which is one stretches a little bit to call it a sacred space, but it's his second roofless room. And it's in Dallas, and many of us drive by it all the time when we go to take our aunts and uncles and visiting cousins to the 6th floor, or when we're scuttling through downtown Dallas on the rare attempts that most of us make to go there. And one sees this amazing building, built as a memorial to a slain president, a building that was incredibly thought through, and it went through a long gestation period in which a lot of citizens of Dallas raised money and built it. And I'm really happy to say that this space, which we have oddly enough practically forgotten about, is being reconsidered by Philip Johnson. And tomorrow morning we're going down together to look again at this space and to see how he now can help us re-see it and revive it and make it the powerful, roofless room that he envisioned when he got this commission in 1966. To me, the most beautiful chapel in America is our chapel in Thanksgiving Square in downtown Dallas. It's a chapel that when I talk to people who visit Dallas, or people who live in Dallas, almost all of us know where Thanksgiving Square is, have driven around it, have walked occasionally through it, but I've talked to very few people who've actually gone in. And going into this building is extraordinary. First of all, because you see it, it makes you move around it as you go through, and this is the way to it from the great Carillon, and you go down and you see it, and as you're going up that ramp with the water rushing down, and you hear the water drowns out the sound of the streets, and you're going up and you enter this little slip of a building, and you look up and you see glass made by the great glassmaker of Chartres Cathedral. The model of this building is not a Christian model, but a Muslim model. One of the greatest buildings of all religious architecture is the great spiral mosque at Samarra. And that building is the model transformed brilliantly through glass and light. So one great religious tradition and another great religious tradition are married in a space that's about Thanksgiving, that attempts to transcend the particularities of faith and embrace all faiths beautifully. I know of no building that does it so successfully. Of course, the prototype for the building that we are looking forward to so strongly in Dallas, the Cathedral of Hope, is the Crystal Cathedral. And the Crystal Cathedral is in Culver City, California, and it was the work of an amazing man, who do you call him a minister, a preacher, whatever he is, Dr. Robert Schuller, the sort of force that with Philip Johnson created this building. And it's a building which started out without a budget. It's sort of nice to start out a building without a budget. And it has its prototypes. I love this. This is the end of the Crystal Cathedral, and one has to remember that Philip Johnson actually studied with and collaborated with Mies van der Rohe. And this is a project for a building by Mies van der Rohe. And this is a weird idea for a building, or it's a massing study by Hugh Ferris, done in the 1920s in New York. So the prototypes for buildings, for sacred buildings, in Philip Johnson's mind are very broad and very interesting. And one sees this shape of a building that pushes out from itself, that pushes into the environment, that's reflective, that embraces the environment, and one goes in and there are 4,000 seats in a building with no heating and no air conditioning and only louvers to let in the wonderful balmy climate of California. We can't do that in Texas, but which is why the Cathedral of Hope is not glazed. But here is a room that celebrates inclusion and music, and that is amongst the most televised and therefore the most widely known modern buildings of the 20th century. About 10 years after in fact, exactly 10 years after the building was built, the vertical element that was needed from the very beginning was added in this extraordinary carillon tower that seems to thrust up as if a series of knives of light coming out of the earth, thrusting into the sky, like a 15th century Gothic tower that resounds with the sounds of bells, was added to these glazed and shiny windows. The building that's the closest to us, and again, the building that I have not yet seen, and I urge all of us to get into our little Southwest and take friends with us and go to Houston and see Philip Johnson's newest ecclesiastical building, St. Basils for St. Thomas University in Houston, a building that you see here fitting into one of Philip Johnson's earliest buildings from the mid-1950s, the campus for St. Thomas, and here one sees it today completed. A perfect white cube slashed through with a shiny black wall with a gilded dome on the top, bringing into the 20th century and making dynamic a series of forms that are deeply rooted in the history of Christian architecture. Here one sees another side where he pulls away. It's as if the building is made of something soft and it's sliced with a knife and pulled away, and it's pliant enough that the architect can now do this. And when one goes into the inside, the sense of soaring, of interruption, of the symbolism of light, and of the idea of being in a sacred space that, though small, is filled with light and therefore infinitely large. This notion is a very powerful notion, and when I see these slides, which came from New York just yesterday so I could show them to you, it makes me want to go to Houston to see the building. And I'm showing you a slide now of another cathedral, a cathedral which was in many ways the life work of one of the greatest and most eccentric architects of the late 19th and early 20th century, Antonio Gaudí of Barcelona, Spain. It's called Sagrada Familia, the Holy Family. It was a building that was built in a way outside of the official strictures of the Catholic Church to be a new kind of religious space. And this building, which was incompleted at Gaudí's death in 1926, is now being completed with extraordinary rapidity with money from Spain, Spanish citizens, the Spanish government, and most of all from Japan. And it's being completed as we speak. It aims to be the first great 19th century cathedral to be finished in the 21st century. And I hope that all of us in Dallas can work with Michael and can work with Philip Johnson to make sure that we have the first real 21st century cathedral. Thanks.
My latest sacred space is, of course, the local cathedral, and I call it now structured warp. But all those panels they meet together at arises, at joints that take the place of Gothic columns. Aris is an architectural term for two planes that join together, like that. How that joins and what happens in the sunlight when it leans toward you, tealing away from you could understand because that's a normal building. But what happens when that wall tilts out just a little? That's going to be exciting. I love to walk under a wall that leans out ever so slightly over your head. It doesn't really lean over your head for the first 40 or 50 feet, but that's very high. But they play, they lean, they twist, they turn, and in between them is stretched, a tegument, as it were. That's structured warp. It's the warp of, in this case, concrete, but so what? That twists and turns around these corners, inside turning, outside turning, leaning, and it makes a play that has been missing in Gothic architecture, so I thought we better improve on that and express more the feelings of our time. A sacred space, of course, in general, to get this out of our minds,
Right.
is the only important job of an architect. I'm not religious myself, I have to confess right off the bat, but there's nothing you can think of than working for God. I mean, how could you ever work for a mere man or a mere woman, or the kitchens and all that, and toilets, all those unimportant things, when you can build space that can elevate you and make you feel in the proper mood. We can do it a little bit in a concert hall because Beethoven does need a beautiful room to listen to in. But only one client can give you that feeling, and that's working for religion. Because everybody knows that is their deepest thoughts are expressed to themselves, maybe, in a church. And an architect has to do that. His highest job in the world is to express that kind of feeling in stone. And that is why I'm on earth, and that's why all my architecture friends are on earth, and that's why my friend Rick chose to talk tonight about sacred spaces. He says, every building I do, you can make sacred. I remember I had a competition once on outhouses. Well, if they didn't have that element of monumentality, I threw it out right away. I mean, every single building you do has to have some sense of aspiration, some sense of striving for the eternal. And that's why it's so good to be here, and that's why it's so important to build this greatest cathedral. It'll be the greatest cathedral, not of the 20th century, but certainly of the 21st. But then that is the trick of an architect, if I'm any good, to make this thing exciting on its own. Exciting because of the finish. Exciting because of the uniqueness. I want to do a building that Dallas will be proud of. Well, for instance, why do we go to museums now? We go to museums because there's less interest in organized religion. The museums are the people, this is an old common saying,
right,
but museums are the churches of today. It doesn't quite work. I mean, I can't pray in this building. As much as I admire Drick and especially Ed Barnes, who's a close friend and classmate of mine, he has done the best job here in Dallas. And he did the best job he's ever did for the simple reason he worked with Rick Brettell. In other words, you've got to have a great client if you're going to have great architecture. Frank Gehry couldn't have built his church. Oh, it isn't a church, it's a museum.
It isn't a church, exactly.
So what? It's a church in Bilbao. And if you haven't been, save up your pennies and go at once. Because that is the greatest building of the 20th century. The greatest building an American has ever done. And the greatest building in Europe. You can't get into the town anymore because it's been such a pilgrimage. I go every year. It's my pilgrimage. As an architect, I want to see that building again and again.
Well, 4 million people have seen it since it's been built.
Is that so?
4 million people.
Well, I've only seen it 3 times, but next year it'll be the 4th. But then it's impossible to describe it as proper. How can you describe Chartres Cathedral where you have been? I hope. If
you didn't
not,
list that first. Usually when you talk about sacred architecture, you say,
well, but I changed that because I think it's much more germane to what we're doing now, is to talk about Bilbao.
Right.
And that is the building that we all have to check ourselves up against. Frank Gehry spent many years on it. You have to on a cathedral. I will spend all the rest of my life on the cathedral in Dallas.